Okay, so let's go through the respiratory system. So the primary function is to put oxygen into the bloodstream and remove carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream. So basically what it does is that filters of air particles from air you breathe in. It controls the temperature of the air that reaches your lung. It controls the moisture within the air, and it plays a role in the vocal sounds, olfaction, and then it regulates the pH so it's less acidic. So it's made up of different parts. So the upper respiratory tract is your nose, your nasal cavity, your paranasal sinuses, and the pharynx. Lower respiratory tract, it's the larynx, the trachea, the bronchial trees, and the lungs. Okay. So respiratory epithelium, it's used to describe any mucus membrane that lines the respiratory system. It is ciliated, pseudostratified, or ciliated simple columnar epithelium. It is everywhere except the lower pharynx and the alveoli of the lungs. The most of the so pharynx has stratified squamous epithelium, and alveoli has simple squamous epithelium. And most of the respiratory epithelial is mucous membrane, meaning that it's going to have a lot of goblet cells to secrete the mucus. Your mucus is important to track the particles. So you have cilia, right? So the cilia sweeps the mucus and particles towards the esophagus and the stomach. And you use your digestive system to destroy anything that might have gotten trapped in your mucus or your respiratory system. So your stomach is handy for destroying a lot of pathogens and bacteria. And a lot of things have a hard time living in the hydrochloric acid. So respiratory epithelium dumps all the mucus that has particles directly into your stomach. So the cilia is kind of like, the janitors kind of just like cleaning up the area, bringing all the, particles into the stomach to burn die. The nose. So it conditions the air so it doesn't damage the lungs. The hairs and the mucus that line your nose are important and they guard the entrance from debris. These hairs are important to keep large particles out of your respiratory system. Your nose is important to help you modify your speech resonance, amplify and modify sound that you produce, supported by bones and hyaline cartilage. You have your nasal cavity. It's separated from the left and right of the nasal septum. So you have the vomer and ethmoid bones that make up the nasal concha. And the nasal concha are like the shell-like bone sections that extend outward from your nasal cavity. So these have like little conchas and stuff like that to increase the surface area. So more surface areas help condition and moisturize the air before it gets to your lungs and warm up the air when you're breathing. Either cold, like cold air to hot, hot air to cold, like warming up. So you have paranasal cavities. You have your frontal, ethmoid, esophageal, and maxillary. And your pharynx, right? This one's a passageway for respiratory and digestive system. So the food travels esophagus and the air goes to the larynx, trachea, and towards the lungs. So the pharynx has epithelial tissue. It's mostly stratified squamous epithelial. And it's kind of voluntary control because you do have like consciously eat like swallowing things. And it has a superficial layer which is closer to the lumen, and it has a circular layer. And the deeper layer is longitudinal. It helps with contractions with peria periostalis with the digestive system. So we have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. So there are 7 openings into the pharynx. So it has 5 openings. So internal nares, auditory tubes, and the pharyngeal tonsils. So oropharynx, right, is the soft palate to the higher bone. The opening is called the fauces. It has 2 pairs of tonsils, 2 palatine tonsils, and 2 linguinal tonsils. Okay, and then we have the larynx, which they have the epiglottis, which hover up the opening to the larynx when swallowing food, so that because you don't want the food and water to like mix together, and the opening is called the glottis. So we have the larynx. So this conducts air into and out of the trachea. It prevents the foreign objects from entering the trachea, and it houses the vocal cords. So the larynx is inferior to the pharynx. It conducts air in and out the trachea, and it prevents the foreign objects from entering the trachea, and it houses vocal cords. So it's made of nine. So there's the thyroid, the cricoid, the epiglottal, and the arsenal. Okay, so let me tell you which. Okay, so thyroid. Okay. The epiglottal cartilage is like when you swallow food, the larynx pushes it up, which pushes the glottis down. The artenoid cartilage, it modulates and moves the vocal folds. We have the larynx, the muscular fold. The opening is the glottis. It gets covered up by the epiglottis when you swallow. When you swallow food, you'll cover up your epiglottis and you're going to contract down on folds that you have the larynx. You have two sets of folds. You have the vestibular folds that close off the glottis when swallowing, and the vocal folds that produce sound when you're speaking. So when you want to speak, you constrict down on muscles that pull on the arsenal cartilage would pull on the vocal folds and tighten them so you can pass air between them and vibrate like a whistle. So when you're breathing while speaking, the vocal folds have a space between them and you can see down the glottis. So trachea is the most superior organ to the bronchial tree. So the bronchial tree are tubes that conduct air through lungs. It takes the air that after it's gone to the larynx and conducts it down the bronchial tree and leads down to the lungs. The trachea has a tube that is 1 inch in diameter and 5 inches in length. And so right after it enters the thoracic cavity, it branches. So in this, you can see the mucosa lining is the inner layer along the lumen. It's lined, and its job is to secrete mucus and has cilia to trap any particles that make it way past the larynx. And then caught gets wet by the larynx, up the trachea, dumps esophagus into stomach. Submucosa is areolar connective tissue. It's a bunch of glands, cubital epithelial glands, and it has ducts that dump additional secretions into the mucosal layers. You have hyaline cartilage that it doesn't go around the trachea. It keeps the trachea open. But if you don't have rings, every time you breathe in and out, your trachea will collapse on itself because you have a hard time getting air passed through. So the trachea, you can flex, you can expand. The esophagus sits right behind it. So after the trachea, you move to the rest of the bronchial tree. At the base of the trachea, there's a notch called a carina, and it's responsible for your coughing reflex. So if you swallow something by accident, it hits the carina, it will trigger the uncontrollably coughing so you can catch it back up to your esophagus. And branching off the carina, there would be like branches like your main primary bronchus and left main primary bronchus. And one for each lobe of the lungs. So the right lung has three secondary bronchi, superior bronchus, a middle, and inferior. For the left is only, the two lobes, so superior, inferior. We have the tertiary bronchi, which branch into smaller structures called the bronchioles. And the mucous membrane is non-ciliated and simple capoidal. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia on it. So these are referred as respiratory bronchi. You have simple capoidal epithelium. You also have muscles instead of cartilage. And you have the pleural membrane, that is a double layer serous membrane surrounding the lungs. Have two layers fold back on themselves, and the inner layer is the visceral pleura. This is a layer against the thoracic cavity. This is the lung. Heart is surrounded by pericardial membrane, which are the serous membrane. Lungs are surrounded by pleural membrane. Both are double-layered membranes that secrete serous fluid to help prevent organs from sticking to each other and potentially tearing. The heart is in the left side, so there's less space for your left lung, so that's why your right lung is bigger in size. It also has the cardiac notch, which takes up space because your heart is on your left side. So there are lobes. There are connections between bronchioles and lungs. So the hilum is a flattened area where all the tubes, blood vessels, bronchioles, lymphatic vessels enter into the lung. Lungs contain simple squamous epithelium that makes up the alveoli, bronchioles, and lymphatic capillaries in lungs prevent any pathogens that might be coming in through your airways. So a lot of nerves in lungs. So alveoli are the site of exchange between cardiovascular system and respiratory system. So you can diffuse gas between blood air and air you breathe in. So it's made of simple squamous epithelium to allow diffusion of the gas. So interlobular bronchioles divide to terminal bronchioles, and the tiniest bronchioles are respiratory bronchioles. And they open to the alveolar duct. There's no muscle tissue, so it opens up to the alveolar sac. So we have two types. Type 1, diffuse gas, breaks up the wall. CO2 in the blood diffuse into alveolus so you can exhale any oxygen you breathe in. And type 2 is to produce the suffocant. So suffocants reduces surface tension by secreting substances that have lipids in them, fluids, phospholipids, and lipoproteins to help reduce the surface tension of fluid. Prevents the alveolar from collapsing and sticking to itself. So when you drown, right? When you breathe in pool water, it removes the suffocant. Alveoli may stick to itself and might not open them back up and can rupture. We also have immune cells. There's no mucus and cilia down there except for immune cells. So, macrophages are large immune cells that are going to engulf the pathogens, and the monocytes are there ready to convert themselves to become macrophages. Oh, there's emphysema, and this one is the walls of alveoli are destroyed. So what happens is the thin walls between alveoli break down. You no longer have as much surface area. You have less type 1 alveolar cells, can't get as much oxygen. And it slows down the gas exchange between the air you breathe in and your cardiovascular system. So you take a deep breath, right? It breaks more alveoli, and over time your chest will expand. And the cause is the inflammation in the body, the lung irritants, and with lung cancer, right? This is where anytime you breathe in things that is not air, it will damage your lung. It will hold it inside your lungs. Or we have inspiration. So it's breathing in air. The phrenic nerve stimulates the diaphragm to contract. And a nerve that goes from brainstem to diaphragm to say to contract and inhale air. Higher inspiration. This one you can just sit around, Maximum is like it recruits more muscles to take a deeper breath. In condition to your diaphragm and external intercostals, you have your sternocleidomastoid, scalene muscles, and scalene muscles are oblique muscles that go diagonal, and your pectoralis minor to help elevate 3 and 5. Expiration, you can do this without any muscle contraction. It just relaxes all your muscles. Wow. Forced exhalation, you use internal intercostals and abdominal wall muscles. Oh yeah. And then when you cough, you start by deep inhalation. Use the epiglottis to close off the glottis. You force air up, uncap your glottis, and you will close up the opening between your pharynx and oral cavity by using your ova, which is the tissue between your oral cavity. So we have the area of the brain that regulates breathing. So we have the pontine respiratory group, which is a set of neurons above pons, with the medullary respiratory center, which are the neurons in the medulla oblongata. I always talk to respiratory muscles using the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerve. The phrenic nerve goes to your diaphragm, and the coastal goes to the external intercostal muscles. These two are important for tidal breathing. And no assimilation means two muscles will not contract and allow passive tidal exhalation. So it's basically pontines and medulla. They're like, okay, let's work together. Work together so you can have a breathing pattern. We have the peripheral chemoreceptors that check oxygen and carbon dioxide content of blood. So it influences respiratory centers. It's special sensory nerves that are in different parts of the cardiovascular system to check the O2 and the CO2 content in blood. So it talks to the brain around the carotid arteries, And there are chemoreceptors that check the blood content to make sure, um, yeah, that would it kind of just stabilize it. So exercise, right? More cardiovascular means more blood flow, which means more capillaries, which means increased diffusion of oxygen. More exercise means you become more efficient. Your body becomes at diffusing oxygen from your lungs into your capillary running lungs. So when you age, right, your lungs are less elastic, but and as you age, your respiratory tract produces less mucus, so your cilia doesn't work as well. Older people are more susceptible to respiratory infections, and also, nicotine constricts the terminal bronchi and reduces the amount of air that goes into alveoli. So anytime you inhale anything with carbon monoxide, it can go into the lungs and reduce your hemoglobin ability to bind to oxygen. When you inhale anything that's not air, it damages the mucosal lining of your bronchial tree. It slows down the movement of cilia, so they sweep mucus and pathogens at a slower rate. It increases susceptibility to respiratory illness. And the damage is irreversible.